Let's go to 19th century America. Louisiana was purchased from France at $15 million in 1803, which Western farmers the opportunity to use the Mississippi River waterway, which provided U.S. settlers vast land for expansion and settlement. It also removed the French presence from the West. It included 15 states of U.S. and 2 provinces from Canada from current map. After the resumption of war between France and Great Britain, British ships frequently harassed American trade vessels in the Atlantic. Not only did the harassment disrupt America's international trade, but it also resulted in the impressment of American sailors. Because of desertions in the Royal British Navy, British naval forces had to recover their losses. As a result, they forced Americans to serve in their navy. They justified impressment by claiming that because American sailors were once British, they were always British. On June 22, 1807, the British frigate Leopard stopped the U.S. frigate Chesapeake off the coast of Virginia and demanded permission to search the ship for British deserters. When their demand was refused, the British attacked the American ship, killing 3 sailors and wounding 18 more. After the attack, British naval forces announced their intention to search all American vessels. In response, Congress passed the Embargo Act of 1807, which put a complete stop to all foreign exports, and which virtually stopped all imports. The point of the Embargo Act was to punish the British and French until they began to respect the authority of the American nation. In actuality, however, American merchants were punished because they were prohibited from exporting. In 1809, Jefferson signed the Non-Intercourse Act, which repealed the Embargo Act and opened foreign trade to all countries except France and Great Britain. The Non-Intercourse Act proved impossible to enforce, and was replaced with Macon's Bill No. 2 by Congress in 1810. Macon's Bill No. 2 allowed for the resumption of trade with all nations including Great Britain and France. Napoleon I of France indicated he would respect U.S. neutrality in the war between England and France, if the U.S. reimposed non-intercourse with England. The U.S. President at the time, James Madison, agreed, and subsequently suspended trade with England. Pressured by Henry Clay, John the 100th Calhoun and others, Madison called up 100,000 militiamen for 6 months' service for the purposes of declaring war on England. Despite poor preparations, weak military units, a central government that was not taken seriously in the Northeast, and opposition from the Federalist Party, the war commenced. It started off poorly as U.S. forces were routed in several attempts to invade English strongholds in Canada. Furthermore, British naval forces had staged a powerful naval blockade along much of America's Atlantic coast, which prevented any imports or exports. On August 19, 1812, British forces and their allied Indians invaded and took Detroit, Michigan. U.S. naval forces did manage a victory against British forces off the coast of Nova Scotia. Nevertheless, the blockade remained in place. On September 10, 1813, American naval forces under General Oliver Hazard Perry won a major victory over British forces at Lake Erie on Pennsylvania's coastline. Because the American victory closed off British navigation of Lake Erie, British forces evacuated Detroit. The retreating British and Indian forces were subsequently engaged at the Battle of Thames River in Upper Canada, where Shawnee Chief Tecumseh was killed and the British lost control of southwestern Ontario. Despite the mounting American victories, English forces had defeated France in Europe. The British victory made available large numbers of troops and supplies which were sent to America in 1814. Nevertheless, setbacks continued to plague the British. Their southern campaign was thwarted by Andrew Jackson's bloody victory over Creek Indians at Horseshoe Bend, Alabama, and set the stage for a massive battle at New Orleans. In August of 1814, however, substantial British forces sailed through the Chesapeake Bay and landed in Maryland. British forces routed American resistance at Bladensburg, Maryland, and quickly took the American capital Washington. On August 24 to 25, British forces burned Washington to the ground. Despite the bombardment of Baltimore, Maryland, which resulted in Francis Scott Key authoring the Star-Spangled Banner, American forces resisted. On September 11, 1814, American forces defeated the British at Lake Champlain and thwarted a large-scale British invasion from Canada. After the defeat at Lake Champlain, and because American trade with a defeated France was no longer an issue, royal authorities decided to abandon the war in America. On December 14, 1814, America and England signed the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the war and called for the abandonment of British forts along its northwestern frontier. Despite the Treaty of Ghent, word of the war's end failed to reach all areas. General Andrew Jackson, a band of pirates, and several armies of free black men, Kentucky militia, and Louisiana militia defeated the much larger British forces at the Battle of New Orleans. At the end of the battle, American casualties numbered 71, while British casualties exceeded 2,000. Despite the fact that the war was over, if New Orleans had not have fallen into America's hands, England would not have honored the Treaty of Ghent, and would not have surrendered New Orleans. Monroe Doctrine, December 2, 1823, cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy enunciated by Pres. James Monroe in his annual message to Congress declaring that the Old World and New World had different systems, and must remain distinct spheres, Monroe made 4 basic points. 1. The United States would not interfere in the internal affairs of or the wars between European powers. 2. The United States recognized, and would not interfere with existing colonies and dependencies in the Western Hemisphere. 3. The Western Hemisphere was closed to future colonization. And 4. Any attempt by a European power to oppress or control any nation in the Western Hemisphere would be viewed as a hostile act against the United States. The Indian Removal Act was signed into law by President Andrew Jackson on May 28, 1830, authorizing the president to grant lands west of the Mississippi in exchange for Indian lands within existing state borders. A few tribes went peacefully, but many resisted the relocation policy. During the fall and winter of 1838 and 1839, the Cherokees were forcibly moved west by the United States government. Approximately 4,000 Cherokees died on this forced march, which became known as the Trail of Tears. The Seminole Wars, also known as the Florida Wars, were 3 conflicts in Florida between the Seminole tribe and the United States Army. These wars consisted of 3 different wars, including the First Seminole War from 1816 to 1819, the Second Seminole War from 1835 to 1842, and the Third Seminole War from 1855 to 1858. Together, the Seminole Wars were the longest and most expensive, both in human and monetary terms, of all the Indian Wars in United States history. In the 1940s, the Seminole who remained in Florida began to move to reservations and establish official tribal governments. There are several official Seminole tribes in Florida today. In 1845, Mexico refused the annexation of Texas, which resulted in Mexican-American War. The war finally ended in 1848 with Treaty of Guadalupe, which gave New Mexico, California and adjacent areas to U.S. White Americans of North and South were indeed different on the issue of slavery. When Abraham Lincoln became the president who was anti-slavery, states supporting slavery formed Confederate States of America with their own government, and civil war broke out. The Civil War ended with the defeat of Confederates. President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863, as the nation approached its third year of bloody civil war. The proclamation declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are, and henceforward shall be free. On the evening of April 14, 1865, John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor and Confederate sympathizer, assassinated President Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. After death of Lincoln, Andrew Johnson became the president and led the Reconstruction, i.e. the settlement of African American in the society and progressing America from the losses of Civil War. In 1871, Bell started working on the harmonic telegraph, a device that allowed multiple messages to be transmitted over a wire at the same time. While trying to perfect this technology, which was backed by a group of investors, Bell became preoccupied with finding a way to transmit human voice over wires. By 1875, Bell, with the help of his partner Thomas Watson, had come up with a simple receiver that could turn electricity into sound. Other scientists, including Antonio Meucci and Elisha Gray, were working on similar technologies, and there's some debate over who should be credited with the invention of the telephone. It's said that Bell raced to the patent office to be the first to secure the rights to the discovery. On March 7, 1876, Bell was granted his telephone patent. A few days later, he made the first ever telephone call to Watson, allegedly uttering the now famous phrase, "Mr. Watson, come here. I want you." Edison was the quintessential American inventor in the era of Yankee ingenuity. He began his career in 1863, in the adolescence of the telegraph industry, when virtually the only source of electricity was primitive batteries, putting out a low-voltage current. Before he died, in 1931, he had played a critical role in introducing the modern age of electricity. From his laboratories and workshops emanated the phonograph, the carbon button transmitter for the telephone speaker and microphone, the incandescent lamp, a revolutionary generator of unprecedented efficiency, the first commercial electric light and power system, an experimental electric railroad, and key elements of motion picture apparatus, as well as a host of other inventions. Beginning in the early 1870s, railroad construction in the United States increased dramatically. Prior to 1871, approximately 45,000 miles of track had been laid. Between 1871 and 1900, another 170,000 miles were added to the nation's growing railroad system. Much of the growth can be attributed to the building of the transcontinental railroads. In 1862, Congress passed the Pacific Railway Act, which authorized the construction of a transcontinental railroad. The first such railroad was completed on May 10, 1869. By 1900, 4 additional transcontinental railroads connected the eastern states with the Pacific coast.